Friends, thank you for being here today. We need to talk about a moment that recently occurred, a moment that history will likely record as the precise second the post-World War II order in North America began to fracture. It didn't happen with a missile launch or a declaration of war. It happened in a sterile fluorescent-lit conference room in Brussels during a standard NATO working group meeting in January 2026. These meetings are usually scripted affairs. They are boring by design. The Americans circulate a draft communique. The smaller allies nod, and the Canadians usually apologize for their budget numbers before signing on the dotted line. It is a ritual that has defined Western defense for 70 years. Washington leads and Ottawa follows. But this time the script was burned when the American delegation put forward a standard clause about unified maritime command in the Arctic legal language that would have effectively subordinated Canada's new Arctic defense assets to NATO, and by extension, American command. The room stopped. The Canadian representative, a senior civil servant rather than a politician, politely but firmly said, "Canada cannot agree to that language. The assets in question will remain under national command." The American admiral leading the discussion assumed it was a translation error. He asked for clarification. The Canadian repeated it. National command, no automatic delegation. That silence, you can imagine filling the room in Brussels, is the sound of the Pentagon officially becoming paralyzed regarding the defense of the North American continent. Most people do not realize it yet. But Canada has just triggered a quiet crisis that fundamentally alters our relationship with the United States. By refusing to hand over the keys to our northern door, we have sent shock waves through the Oval Office and defense contractors in Washington. Today, we are going to look past the headlines and the noise. We're going to analyze exactly why Canada made this unprecedented move, what it means for your sovereignty, and why, for the first time in history, the United States is realizing that its quiet, polite neighbor has decided to build a fence and keep the gate locked. To fully understand why the Pentagon is in such a state of shock, we have to look deeper than just the meeting room. We have to look at the invisible architecture of our defense intelligence. For generations, the relationship between Canada and the United States has been defined by the Five Eyes Alliance. The operating assumption has always been total automatic information awareness. If a Canadian listening post in Alert, Nunavut, picks up a signal, an analyst in Maryland sees it simultaneously. It is a fire hose of data flowing freely across the border. This arrangement was based on trust and the assumption that our interests were identical. But the geopolitical reality has shifted. With the rise of America First policies and threats to annex Canadian territory or treat our trade as a national security risk, Ottawa realized that total transparency had become a strategic liability. What Canada unveiled in Brussels acts as a rupture in this intelligence flow, a new doctrine of data sovereignty. The new independent Arctic defense network that Canada is building explicitly keeps command and control solely in Canadian hands. There are no dual keys. There's no joint authority. Here is the practical implication that keeps American generals up at night. Under this new system, the raw data from Canada's new Arctic sensors goes to Ottawa first. Canadian officials then decide what to share, what to redact, and when to share it with Washington. And we have effectively put a valve on the fire hose. We have turned automatic access into access upon request. For the American intelligence community, this is the equivalent of suddenly going blind in one eye. Their global military posture, particularly their nuclear deterrence, relies on knowing where every threat is at all times. If a Russian submarine with nuclear capability is lurking under the Arctic ice cap in Canadian internal waters, the United States needs to know yesterday. But now they will have to ask Canada for that picture. This transforms the U.S. from a co-owner of North American defense into a client of Canadian intelligence. It is not an alliance of equals. It is a declaration that on Canadian soil and in Canadian waters, Ottawa holds the master password. I want to pause here and ask you directly, do you think Canada is right to withhold this data? Is limiting American access a necessary step for our independence, or do you think it's a dangerous gamble that could backfire on our national security? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This rupture extends beyond software and data. It is effectively a technological divorce that is being cemented in hardware. For decades, the American military-industrial complex viewed Canada as a captured market. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing have entire divisions dedicated to what they literally call Canadian capture. They assumed that when Canada finally decided to spend real money on Arctic defense, it would flow directly into their coffers. They assumed Canada would buy sensors that plug directly into the American grid, locking us into their upgrade cycles and their foreign policy whims for the next 30 years. They were wrong. In a move that has caused incandescent rage inside the Washington Beltway, Canada has chosen a different path. We are partnering with European firms for sensor technology, partners who are willing to transfer intellectual property rather than just selling us black boxes. Canada is building a sovereign constellation of low Earth orbit LEO surveillance satellites. Now, these are not NATO integrated systems. They are Canadian satellites controlled by Canadian engineers. We are procuring a fleet of long-range armed patrol drones designed specifically for our topography. We are keeping the data processing and command infrastructure entirely within Canada. Essentially, we are building a separate internet for the Arctic. Why is this technical detail so important for a Canadian concerned with sovereignty? Because it prevents vendor lock-in. If we bought American systems and a future U.S. president decided to pressure Canada on trade or water rights, they could theoretically our defense capabilities by withholding software updates or spare parts. By building a domestic solution with European help, Canada has escaped that trap. We have ensured that no matter who sits in the Oval Office, the lights stay on in the Canadian North. This is the equivalent of a homeowner deciding not to hook up to the neighbor ES Wi-Fi anymore, even though it was free. It asks about ensuring that no one can throttle your connection when they disagree with what you're watching. It is a massive investment in autonomy. Naturally, you might be asking why now? Why, after decades of underfunding and reliance on the U.S., has Canada suddenly decided to flex its muscles? The answer lies in the geopolitical catalyst of the High North, the melting ice and the battle for the Northwest Passage. The Arctic is melting, and as the ice recedes, the old gentlemen's agreements are melting with it. For decades, Canada and the U.S. managed their disagreement over the Northwest Passage with a handshake. Canada claims these waters are internal, part of our sovereign territory, just like the Rio Canal or the St. Lawrence River. The United States claims it is an international strait, meaning anyone can sail through it without asking permission. When the ice was thick and the passage was impassable for most of the year, we could afford to agree to disagree. The U.S. would ask permission before sending icebreakers, and Canada would grant it. We never had to test the legal question in court or at sea. But climate change has changed the physics and therefore the politics. The Northwest Passage is opening up shipping lanes that will soon rival the Panama Canal, worth trillions of dollars in transit fees and insurance. It is exposing rare earth minerals, oil reserves, and natural gas deposits that could power nations for centuries. We can no longer rely on a handshake deal when trillions of dollars are on the table. The United States, hungry for resources and strategic depth, is pushing harder for the passage to be internationalized. If Canada does not assert hard control, if we cannot see, track, and intercept vessels in our own waters, we lose our claim to sovereignty by default. This is why the paralysis at the Pentagon is so critical. The U.S. assumed that Canada would just be a parking lot for American military assets in the North. They assumed they could control the Arctic through Ottawa. By asserting control over the Northwest Passage with new hard power assets, Canada is saying, this is not a parking lot. This is our house, and you need to knock before you enter. However, while we manage our complex relationship with the United States, we are also facing an adversarial squeeze from the wolves circling our perimeter. The decision to trigger this crisis wasn't taken in a vacuum. It was forced upon us by the aggressive actions of our adversaries. Russia has been militarizing its Arctic coast for over a decade. They have refurbished Soviet-era bases, deployed hypersonic missiles, and built the world's largest fleet of nuclear icebreakers, over 40 of them. Compare that to the United States, which has 2 aging vessels that frequently break down. Russia is unpredictable, aggressive, and currently holds the dominant hand in Arctic infrastructure. Their goal is to force shipping through their northern Sea-Doo route, where they can charge transit fees and exert control. They want to make the Canadian route unviable by creating chaos and insecurity. Then there is the People's Republic of China. Despite being thousands of miles away, Beijing has declared itself a near-Arctic state. This is a fabricated term with no basis in international law, but they are backing it up with presence. We have seen this wrong too, a Chinese research vessel mapping the seafloor in our waters. They claim it is for science, but intelligence experts know better. They are mapping submarine routes. They are prospecting for critical minerals. This creates a gray zone warfare environment. It isn't an invasion with tanks. It is research vessels gathering data, foreign investors buying up strategic infrastructure, and cyber attacks testing our grid. CSIS, our intelligence service, has issued unprecedented public warnings about this. They have detected both China and Russia gathering intelligence and perhaps more insidiously spreading disinformation to sow distrust between northern communities and the federal government. The Pentagon knows it is behind in the Arctic race against Russia and China. For years, their plan was to use Canadian territory to catch up. By asserting independence, Canada has complicated that plan. We have told Washington that while we share the threat of Russia and China, we will not allow the American response to trample Canadian sovereignty in the process. This brings us to the elephant in the room, the financial pivot, and the cost of Trump-proofing our economy. For years, Canadian leaders dismissed the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense. We argued that Canada contributed in other ways. Peacekeeping, diplomacy, soft power. We argued that quantity isn't everything. But in 2025, under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, that logic was abandoned. Canada is now on track to meet and exceed the 2% target, pouring over $40 billion in new investments into the military over the next 5 years. Why the sudden change? It wasn't just to please NATO Secretary Generals in Brussels. It was a calculated strategy to insulate Canada from American political volatility. With the return of America First rhetoric, threats of tariffs, and open discussion of annexing Greenland or Canada to secure resources, Ottawa realized that reliance was a risk we could no longer afford. When your closest ally decides you are a security threat to justify steel tariffs, you realize that the security umbrella you've been standing under is leaking. This massive spending package is not just about buying jets and ships. It is about buying diplomatic leverage. When Canada sits at the G7 or NATO table now, we are not the freeloaders asking for a favor. We are a heavy lifter with critical assets. This neutralizes American criticism. It strengthens our hand in trade negotiations. It makes it much harder for a U.S. president to bully Canada when we are the ones securing the northern flank of the continent. This is a shift that should resonate with every Canadian who understands the value of financial independence. We are paying a premium now to ensure we don't pay a catastrophic price later. We are buying F-35s, yes, but we are really buying the right to say no. I know $40 billion is a staggering number, especially when we face challenges in healthcare and housing here at home. So I have to ask, do you believe this military investment is the best use of our tax dollars right now? Or should we have continued to rely on the American umbrella to save money? I'm genuinely curious to hear your take on this financial trade-off. Strategic documents and satellite constellations are impressive, but sovereignty is ultimately enforced on the ground, or in our case, on the ice. The crisis triggered in Brussels is being played out daily by the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces in conditions that most of us can barely imagine. We are seeing a transformation of the Canadian presence in the north. It's no longer just about showing the flag in the summer. We are moving toward a near-permanent basis of operations. Take, for example, the HMCS William Hall. This ship and its crew are operating in high Arctic waters, remote and stunning, but also unforgiving. They are practicing for the likely threat. Not a massive D-Day style invasion, but a suspect boat approaching sensitive military sites, engaging in espionage or sabotage. In recent exercises like Operation Nuke, we have seen the integration of the Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard to hunt for these needles in the haste stack. But technology has its limits in the Arctic. Satellites pass over, but they can't see intent. That is where the Canadian Rangers come in. We must acknowledge the complex history here. Decades ago, the Canadian government forcefully relocated Inuit families to the high Arctic to act as human flag pulleys, a traumatic chapter where sovereignty was prioritized over humanity. Today, however, the relationship is evolving into a critical partnership. The Rangers, mostly Indigenous, provide the ground truth. They know when the ice is safe. They know when a vessel looks out of place. They are the sentinels that no American satellite can replace. This human element is Canada's asymmetric advantage. The Americans have technology. We have people who have lived on this land for millennia. By investing in the Rangers and improving infrastructure in northern communities, linking sovereignty to the well-being of the people who live there, we are solidifying a claim to the land that is far stronger than any planted flag. This strategy, however, is not just about soldiers and satellites. It is about building a diplomatic and economic firewall that the United States cannot simply bulldoze. What few in the American media are reporting is that Canada is actively forming a strategic northern bloc. We are realizing that while we may be small compared to the American superpower, we are not alone in our anxiety. Norway, Denmark, via Greenland, Sweden, and Finland share our exact concerns: an aggressive Russia to the east and an overbearing, unpredictable America to the west. By aligning our procurement strategies and sharing intelligence directly with these middle powers, Canada is creating a third pole of influence in the Arctic, a unified front of democratic northern nations that excludes the superpowers from dictating terms. This isn't just diplomacy, it's a survival mechanism. It ensures that when Washington calls to demand access, they aren't just hearing a no from Ottawa. They are hearing it from a coalition that controls the gateway to the Atlantic and the pole itself. Furthermore, we must talk about the dirt itself, specifically the critical minerals lying beneath the permafrost. This is the hidden leverage in Canada's back pocket. The modern American military machine does not run on oil alone. It runs on lithium, cobalt, graphite, and rare earth elements, the very materials required for F-35 fighter jets, guidance systems, and electric vehicle batteries. Currently, the United States is dangerously dependent on adversarial supply chains for these materials. Canada holds some of the largest undeveloped deposits of these strategic assets in the world. By asserting strict sovereignty over the Arctic, Canada is effectively nationalizing the supply chain of the 21st century. We are sending a clear message. If the United States wants secure, ethical access to the minerals that power its future economy and military, it must respect Canadian sovereignty. We are not just a resource colony to be mined. We are a strategic partner that requires equal standing. If they treat us as a subordinate, they risk losing priority access to the very building blocks of their national security. This transforms our natural resources from a commodity into a diplomatic weapon, a silicon shield that protects our political independence. This concept of weaponizing our resources is controversial. Do you trust Ottawa to play this card correctly, or do you fear it will just provoke harsh economic retaliation from Washington? It's a delicate game. Tell me what you think in the comments. Yet we must face the concrete reality that sovereignty cannot be maintained by maps and minerals alone. It requires steel, concrete, and fiber optics. This is the internal front of the crisis, and it is perhaps our greatest vulnerability. For decades, we have allowed a dangerous infrastructure gap to widen between the North and the South. While Russia was building deep water ports and nuclear-powered cities in its Arctic zone, Canada was struggling to pave roads and provide basic broadband internet to Nunavut. This neglect is the crack in our armor that adversaries like China are trying to exploit, offering to build ports and lay cables when Ottawa is too slow. The new nation-building initiative attached to this defense pivot addresses this head-on. It is the realization that you cannot claim to own a house if you refuse to fix the roof. The government's push to finally complete deep-water naval facilities like the Nunavut Naval Facility and to lay sovereign fiber optic lines through the Northwest Passage is about more than just logistics. It is about connecting the 150,000 Canadians who live in the North to the rest of the country. True sovereignty isn't just about keeping foreign armies out. It's about making sure Canadian citizens can thrive there. If we don't build the roads, the ports, and the digital highways, our claim to the Arctic remains hollow, a paper claim in a world of steel realities. This is the great national project of our generation, akin to the building of the Transcontinental Railway. It is expensive, it is difficult, and it is absolutely necessary if we want to remain a G7 nation with a unified border. So, as we reach the conclusion of this analysis, what does this all mean for us? For the average Canadian watching the news and seeing the turmoil, in global markets, it means that the era of Canada as a client state of the U.S. military is over. For over a century, the United States has operated under the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is their sphere of influence and nobody else gets a vote. By triggering this crisis, by paralyzing the Pentagon's automatic assumptions, Canada has effectively rejected that doctrine. We have looked at the political chaos in Washington, the unpredictability of American foreign policy, and the aggressive moves of Russia and China, and we have made a calculation. The risk of depending on America is now greater than the risk of going it alone. This is a psychological earthquake. It is the moment the quiet neighbor stopped being quiet. It is the moment we decided to build our own house rather than living in the guest room of the American empire. Yes, there will be consequences. There will be pressure from Washington. There will be friction at the border. Defense contractors will lobby and complain. But the alternative, total dependency on a nation that has threatened our economy and questioned our sovereignty, is no longer an option. Canada has finally hit the 2% target, but we didn't do it for them. We did it for us. We are building a defense network that we control, data that we own, and a territory that we protect. The Pentagon may be paralyzed by this shift, shocked that their northern dominance is no longer guaranteed. But for Canada, this isn't a crisis. It's a graduation. It's the realization that in a dangerous world, respect isn't given, it's earned. And for the first time in a long time, we are earning it. Now, I turn the question over to you. Is this true independence, or have we bitten off more than we can chew? I read every comment, so please leave your thoughts below. And if you found this analysis valuable, please share it with a friend who needs to know what's happening in the North. Thank you for listening.